Hi, I'm Susan Winter at the University of Maryland. And John?
I'm John King at the University of Michigan. Nick?
Hey, I'm Nick Berente. I'm at the University of Notre Dame.
And I'm Joel Cutcher-Gershenfeld at Brandeis University. We are delighted to welcome you to Making the Leap to Large, a NSF-sponsored seminar which is designed to help scientists and engineers to lead large-scale science and engineering projects. Before we dive into today's agenda, let me just say a brief word of welcome in the sense that you are all unique. You represent among the nation's top scientists and engineers interested in doing large-scale science and engineering projects, and we are delighted to be of service to you in that journey. The journey ahead begins with this brief welcome and overview. We have a short video that we'll share with you. It's designed to sort of set the tone for the session, and it's a video that you can use for educational purposes with your research teams if it's helpful. In a few minutes, Susan will be introducing our first lead speaker, the head of SIZE, Margaret Martinosi, and we're delighted to have her with us. We did a pre-session survey. We'll share with you some early results, as well as taking you into what Nick and John will describe as the 4 dimensions of impact. Susan will then take us into our keynote speaker, our second lead speaker, Stefan Savage, who we're delighted to have with us as well. And then we have an application exercise. Every one of these 7 workshops will have a chance to apply the principles and put them into practice. And of course, at the end, we'll set the stage for the next session. So that's basically the overview. What I'm going to do now is actually stop sharing my screen and take you to a brief video, which we are delighted to share with you, that essentially was an attempt on our part to give you a sense of the workshop. But as I said before, this is a video that is designed, as we'll do with all of the sessions, for potential reuse. So here we go.
Making the leap from a small scientific project to a large NSF science and engineering initiative is a considerable undertaking. All NSF proposals require intellectual merits and broader impacts, both of which face a far higher bar with a large initiative. Take scientist Lucy, for example. She does computational chemistry. Her small and medium scale research is funded by the NSF, and she's good at project management. Now Lucy wants to go large and integrated. But how to make that leap to large? The good news is that NSF wants to fund successful large projects, because large projects are not just small projects cobbled together. They can have a big impact. But large projects involve a broader set of stakeholders, need to make a demonstrable impact, and require integrative enterprise leadership. This workshop provides tested and validated guidance for successfully leading large-scale science in 7 sessions. 1, impact and its 4 dimensions. 2, stakeholder alignment and why it matters. 3, measurement tools for demonstrating impact. 4, leadership and why project management expertise is not enough to lead a large initiative. 5, data and unique challenges with large projects. 6, people and the importance of broad participation. And finally, 7, collaboration across institutions, geographies, and disciplines. A large computer and information science and engineering, SIZE, is over $1.2 million and typically extends for more than 4 years. The grants that are the target for this series of sessions are in the range of $4 million to $10 million. These account for less than 10% of NSF grants, yet are expected to have major impacts and too often lack the needed strategy, structure, and processes to operate at this scale. In making the leap to large, you can accomplish better, more impactful science, aligning diverse stakeholders. So let's get started.
So we're delighted to share that with you and to move us into the workshop. And with that, what I'd like to do is first just very quickly say that this is the first of 7 sessions. Each are on Tuesdays from 12 to 1:30 Eastern Time. And as you can see, the topics are all designed to help you produce large-scale science, engineering, and research projects. To get us started, what I'd like to do is to share with you a little bit about what you said in advance of the session. We will do a pre-session survey before each session. With so many people that have signed up, we couldn't do a check-in as we normally would do, but we did send you an introduction to the survey, and we heard back from over 500 of you. 403 of you completed the survey, and so the results that I'll share here and at other points that will be shared with you come from those 403 responses. First, we were targeting folks interested in making the leap to large, and if you look at our first question, which was how many funded smalls and mediums did you do in the last 5 years, it turns out the majority of you have had 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 small or medium projects in the last 5 years. Some of you have had more, few of you have had none, but you are right in our sweet spot. And as well, most of you have not had a large, some of you have had 1 or 2, and a very small number of you have had more, but you represent our target audience, folks with limited experience in large-scale science and engineering, but with deep experience in smalls and mediums. We did ask you what were your primary funding sources, and of course you could check all that apply. It turns out quite a few of you have, primarily do work with SIZE, which is funding this workshop, and quite a few of you in the engineering directorate at the NSF. We did highlight here all of the responses in red that are above 20%. And of course, you could, as I said, check all that apply. And what it says is that you all come in here with a diverse portfolio of funding sources. And so when you do the breakout rooms, people will probably have sources of support from multiple different federal and other funding sources. Very quickly on demographics, the vast majority of you are in the 11 to 20 or 21 to 30 year range. So although we have some early career folks here, a lot of you are mid-career. And again, that's our target. About a third, slightly more than a third of you are women, 2/3 male or other. And of course, in broadening impacts, we want to see more women in STEM fields. So we'd like to see those numbers larger, but that's who we're hearing from signed up. Similarly, the Hispanic identity, we always ask separately from racial categories. But the long and the short of it is on the racial dimensions, the NSF priority on broadening participation is also reflected in the fact that we have a very large percentage of white folks. Now, of course, 60% of the world's population is Asian, so I'm not surprised that there's a number of Asian respondents. But those of you who are here from underrepresented groups, you are welcome, and we encourage your participation. And frankly, we'd like to see more. We did finally ask you some questions about your must-have for this kind of professional development. And we did a little word cloud with your responses. You highlighted the building skills, doing large projects. We asked you about your barriers, and of course, time, funding, and other things that were missing were highlighted. Just to give you a flavor of what's behind these word clouds, we picked just a couple of selected quotes. There were obviously hundreds of quotes that we sorted through, but essentially about half of your responses in terms of your must-have were the basic skills in project management, in leadership, and in teamwork. As well, though you also highlighted the importance of balancing advancing the science with achieving impact or innovation. A number of you wanted technical skills in how to develop proposals. This is not a proposal workshop, but we will have some insights to share with you that should be helpful in proposals. And a number of you did talk about the importance of finding collaboration with industry or across fields and disciplines. And of course, we'll be talking about that at various times throughout the seminar. And a number of you noted the importance of infrastructure when it comes to large-scale science and engineering, especially around data, something that we'll devote a whole session to. What were the barriers? The biggest barrier was the lack of understanding about just what's involved, but also did you have the resources and the infrastructure and support to do this, including from your institution? A question about how the review process would work or how incentives that are contrary to doing large-scale science would be dealt with. Although some of them are beyond scope of anything you can do individually, these are important insights that we bring to the NSF. And of course, as another barrier, many of you highlighted interpersonal issues or the importance of building the skills to lift up people who are underrepresented. So that's a little bit of what you had to say at the very beginning, even before the seminar starts. The last thing that I'll share with you is that we did have a question: how in a hypothetical would you approximately allocate funding to a PI, to a non-PI, and to project management staff, not counting other project resources? That's a question that we're actually going to use in a couple of ways, but a number of you in your open-ended responses said, well, what was the answer? And of course, there isn't a single answer. Each project is unique. But interestingly, we broke it out by those who have not ever led a large project, those who have led one or two or been a PI or a co-PI, and those that have led three or more, a small number. And what's interesting is, in general, the numbers were remarkably similar, although you will see that the folks with the most experience had slightly smaller numbers of folks putting money in the PI and slightly more for the non-PIs and for project management. Now, I see that there's a hand raised from Doug. Is that something that I need to know about?
No.
Okay. So that gives you just a sense of who you are and what you thought coming in. I'm going to stop here and hand the program over to Susan, who's going to introduce our first keynote speaker.
Thanks, Joel. It's my great pleasure to welcome Dr. Margaret Martinosi for some opening remarks. Dr. Martinosi is the current head, the AD of the National Science Foundation's Directorate of Computer and Information Science and Engineering, SISE. She's also the Hugh Turnbull Adams 35 Professor of Computer Science at Princeton University and the recipient of many awards. She's a member of the National Academy of Engineering and an IEEE Fellow. And she's particularly noted for her research in computer architecture and mobile computing with a focus on energy or power efficiency. Dr. Martinosi.
Thanks so much, Susan, and hi, everyone. They invited me to give a greeting, and I decided to insert a few slides, and I appreciate the indulgence. Let me start by thanking the organizers of this workshop. The huge turnout, I think, indicates that their work is well appreciated already, and I know it's really important for the community. Let me also thank the NSFers who have sort of organized this workshop from our perspective at NSF. And finally, let me thank all of you, the 677 of you on Zoom right now, because we need you. We need you, as Joel said, and we're looking forward to engaging with you in this way. Next slide, please. So what did I want to get across in my brief greeting? First of all, I wanted to encourage all of you to think broadly about the opportunities for team science. It's exciting. It's a learning experience to be able to engage with a broader set of PIs. It's an exciting opportunity to link across disciplinary silos and across different universities, institutions, in order to really get the right team together at scale. And I also want, as you'll see in the next couple slides, I want you to think broadly about the opportunities for being large in terms of research, infrastructure, and workforce impact. Next slide, please. So when I give a lot of talks these days, I give this 2-slide primer about size funding. The first slide is usually this notion about the core, and many of you are already deeply familiar with the core. We see that in your survey results. And you know that we have small and medium programs every year in the core, and sometimes large. And they cross all the size topic areas. So that's great. Next slide, please. This eye chart is what I really wanted to get across today. And that's all the places that you can engage and write proposals that go beyond that core. And they're in different categories here. I'm not going to list them all. But one of the things that I did was I took and highlighted in blue all the places that you can make that leap to large from a size perspective. So yes, that's the Expeditions in Computing program, which is now 12 years old, and we're really proud of its impact. You can do frontier scale in, proposals for SATC, Secure and Trustworthy Cyberspace, and CPS. The National AI Research Institutes have had 2 solicitations now, and we're thrilled with the engagement there. Many of you come from either size or engineering, so you may be familiar with programs like the STCs and ERCs and Sustainable Regional Systems as well. One of the things that I wanted to highlight were the opportunities to think about infrastructure. And so if you could go to the next slide, please. This is a cartoon graph that I started showing maybe 8 or 10 months ago, and it's taken on a life of its own. The special effects of this slide are poor, but the impact, I hope, will be large. This is about infrastructure programs. Now, please don't tune out, because you may not think of yourself as an infrastructure person, but I heard from the survey results that you want data. And let me tell you, data is infrastructure. Software is infrastructure. If you're thinking about what's the next ImageNet or whatever for your community, that's a form of infrastructure. And there's infrastructure funding where you could work with other community members to make the leap to large by providing that at a national scale for a national need. So what this graph shows is sort of across the x-axis from individual needs out to community needs, and up the y-axis is the scale in dollars of the funding that's available. These purple things out here have the name of mid-scale research infrastructure 1 and 2, but they actually are, I think, for many of us, fairly large-scale opportunities. $6 to $20 million is mid-scale 1, and mid-scale 2 is $20 to $100 million. And the key thing, the thing that I will end with, is infrastructure is not just hardware. So if you're a networking person, great. Infrastructure might be hardware to you, but think broadly about infrastructure to include software, data, and people, and think about a leap to large in which you don't just say the community needs data, but you work with the community to provide that data at scale. With that, let me reiterate my thanks to everyone today, and I'm eager to sit back and watch. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martinosi. Those are encouraging words. And next, we're going to hear from John about 4 dimensions of large-scale success.
And by the way, I will say that all of these slides will be posted on the platform. So the details that Margaret shared with us is all available to you. John.
So we're going to talk in these 7 sessions about becoming a large leader. This is a person who is not only successful at getting a large award, but moves from project management to enterprise management. That's kind of a key theme that's going to be throughout these. We're interested in the return on the investment, not just the investment, which of course, getting the award helps provide, but where does that money come from? Where do the resources come from? So we're going to talk about value propositions for stakeholders. Next slide. Now, science and engineering are known to be important. People who do them think they're important, but other people do as well. And some aspects of this are the same over time, and some are changing quite dramatically. One of the changes that's happening, and that's important right now, is that a lot of these projects are becoming bigger. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't still small projects. They have their place and they're important, but the big projects, the largest, is a relatively new phenomenon. Many of these projects are more salient than they used to be. They have lots of eyes on them. Increasingly, these are blended. So you don't hear much anymore the distinction that used to be common science discovers, engineering applies, basic and applied distinctions are kind of blurring, and the large projects loom large in the public eye. Next. So if you go back to July of 1945, you can find this paper that was produced then by Vannevar Bush, who was the director of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. This was a World War II organization that tried to apply science and technology to the war effort. And it figured prominently in the NSF Organic Act of 1950. This was the act that created the National Science Foundation, Science, the Endless Frontier. Next slide. Well, just recently, something called the Endless Frontier Act was introduced into the United States Senate by Senators Schumer and Young. That is a relatively large document that recapitulates a lot of the things that Science, the Endless Frontier talked about. So in this way, it's kind of the same. Now, Boris Johnson recently gave a speech at the United Nations that talked about the importance of science and technology. So this is kind of a movement that we see. Next slide. Now, there are some aspects of science that are changing. Science and engineering are undergoing radical change. This is the entire Watson and Crick paper on the structure of DNA that was published in Nature in 1953, 1,800 words. This is it. This is the entire article. Next slide. You might have seen the article in Science, in the articles in Science in December of 2012 on the Higgs boson. It was the breakthrough of the year. There were 4 articles. Now we know that the Higgs boson project at the Large Hadron Collider at CERN was a big project, but we didn't realize, in a sense, how big the project had really become. There was a kind of a corporate authored article talking about the importance of the Higgs boson discovery in high energy physics. There was also an article which you might call a traditional science and engineering article on how they did it, how they built the Large Hadron Collider, et cetera. And then there were 2 scientific papers, one from the compact muon solenoid experiment, which was the CMS experiment, and it had the byline for that article was the CMS collaboration. And then there was another one on the toroidal device, the ATLAS project, and it was co-authored by the ATLAS collaboration. If you looked at the bottom, at the footnotes that were referenced by these collaborations, you found a pointer to a URL. And when you went to the URL, there was a pointer to a PDF file. And when you opened that PDF file, you discovered that each of these articles had over 3,500 co-authors. So science is growing. Next slide. We also see change in broadening participation. Now, one of the things that happened with the Higgs boson project was some people got the Nobel Prize. And that certainly happened back in 1953 with the discovery of DNA, the structure of DNA. Watson and Crick and Maurice Wilkins all received the Nobel Prize. But there was a lot of controversy around what happened with the work of Rosalind Franklin. She was the X-ray crystallographer who many people believe without her work, the DNA sequencing would never have been done. So that became very controversial. Next slide. But by 2016, this had begun to change. Some of you may have seen this 2016 movie with these 3 African-American women who were important in the space program, Katherine Johnson, Dorothy Vaughan, and Mary Jackson. My colleague here at the University of Michigan, Lynn Conway, wrote an article that appeared in IEEE Computer in 2018 called The Disappeared, in which she talked about this phenomenon, the work of women, or in her case, a transsexual person, or underrepresented minorities simply wiped off the map. That's really changed, I think, dramatically. Another thing that's changed and that a lot of you are kind of wondering about is this openness. Some of you have seen the Holdren memo from 2013 talking about sharing. Once upon a time, the open model of science was sort of publication afterward. publication, and then everything that followed publication. Results, tools and data, the proposal itself, these were all proprietary. That's changed. It's been pushed upstream by the preprint processors and the requirement to have a data management plan for making things available to other people. Next slide. Now that's just some of the things that are kind of clearly in print. Many people are interested in this idea of the return on the investment. So one of the things you can look at, and you can see this from the tire tracks diagram that some of you have seen, the digital libraries projects from the National Science Foundation had one award to Stanford. This became Google. That was a pretty significant impact. Next slide. In the upper left-hand corner, you see an arbitrary computer from back in the olden days. That computer is less powerful than the iPhone that's pictured in the lower right. And some people have said that almost all of the things that went into the iPhone in terms of breakthroughs came originally from funded research, specifically NSF funded research. So we're talking about the move from project management to enterprise management and why that matters for the large. So with that, we turn it over to Nick Berente. He's going to talk a little bit about making sense out of this move to enterprise.
So one way to look at what John's saying is using concentric circles to just kind of help us think through, all right, what's going on here? How is this a change? And one way to think about concentric circle, this enterprise, is that the science that we do, the darkest areas tend to be what we focus on and what we're responsible for. So our field, in our particular field, the science and engineering and the research in our field is where we focus. Now we do focus a little, as you leave the core of what we do, we focus a little bit less, to the point where some of us might spend some time with the general public, but it's typically not the focus of science, right? And that's the tradition. That's the way it's always been, the way it continues to be, perhaps the way it is with smalls and mediums. But then things are evolving, right? Next slide. And things are evolving in such a way that what we focus on is a little bit broader now. We're not just focusing on our field-based research, but we're being under pressure to meet some grand challenges. Focus on broadening participation to a variety of stakeholders. And then this idea of ROI and the general public and that sort of thing, impressions, it's still maybe not the core of our focus, but we're beginning to think about it more and more in all the research that we do. And our argument is this, that when we're taking the leap to large, it's all in our purview. We are focusing on, when you're dealing with an enterprise here and not a research project, the research is core to what you're doing, but so is everything else. And so is understanding the impact and understanding the impact to whom. And that's what our series of sessions is geared to do. We're out here to help you lead these larger enterprises. And to do that, you need to understand your impact. You need to understand the impact that your stakeholders are going to need from you. And you need to understand how to articulate and measure that impact. And you want to be able to lead the enterprise in such a way to actually drive such impact. So that's our goal. And that's how we're going to try to help you in these sessions, give you some actionable tools that you can use right away, not only in your proposals. We've done these sessions a couple of times before, and we found people from the sessions that apply what we learn have done a really good job in getting proposals, actually. But this, as Joel said, this is not a proposal, but what we are giving you are tools to help you. It's not a proposal workshop. We're giving you tools to help you lead large enterprises in order to drive impacts. So what are the impacts? Well, we've worked with a number of different science projects of all sorts over the years, over the decades for some of us. And we found that really there are 4 general dimensions of impact associated with science enterprises that shape much of what we do when we think about leading these enterprises, as well as communicating and understanding that impact. And of course, it's science and engineering. There's the traditional disciplinary science and engineering that we're all familiar with. Workforce, we understand students and how we're upskilling the workforce. Economic, we understand that we need to get funding for our enterprises. And then of course, innovation. There are outcomes other than science that have to do with, say, new technologies that we're interested in driving. And these have all been part of what we do, but there are additional dimensions to each of these that we're finding ourselves increasingly faced with. So for example, there's always the push to cross-disciplinary, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary, and we find that this is more and more important when it comes to larges. Another thing is when we're dealing with science in our fields, incremental science is fine. As we move to large, we find that the pressure to be more transformational our science, right? Bigger, more impactful science is something that we need to do. Workforce, again, there are students, and students are important. And we have students in our labs, we have students in our classrooms, and we're used to understanding in those terms. But there are other ways we're impacting the workforce. We're upskilling. We're upskilling the workforce. We're giving them new capabilities that, for example, in a lot of these, the United States never had. And we need to think about how we're upskilling the top end of the workforce with these new capabilities in new and interesting ways. And then one thing that we've all seen, and it's frankly long due, is the pathways for underrepresented groups that historically weren't always involved in some of these scientific enterprises, right? It's not just a matter of giving it lip service anymore. This is something fundamental and core to the science enterprise currently. Economic, of course, we want to bring in federal funding dollars, but we find that we need to become a little more sophisticated in thinking about things like multipliers, right? The multipliers of our funding dollars, spillovers, complementarities, other economic complementary outcomes associated with with economic funding. And then finally, yes, new technologies and patents. We've played around with that a little, but to go beyond that, startups are increasingly critical to understanding scientific impact of larger, and startups of all sorts, but also not just startup organizations, but startup industries. If you've seen the NSF pathways diagram, or what was it? The tire tracks diagram, right? It's a diagram. It might not be the most vivid. I think it's the greatest story ever told about science impact, but I wish it would be told more forcefully, because it's really one of those great images, the tire tracks. It's one of those great stories anyway. But that's where we are. These are the 4 dimensions of impact. And granted, they're not mutually exclusive. They all relate to each other. This is not a checklist or a formula. What this is we found that these 4 dimensions, if you think in these terms, that helps you be collectively exhaustive, right? Understand all the areas of impact and that you would like to drive. Now, with that said, we are going to do 2 more things today. The first is we're going to, and I think Stefan Savage is online, so we're going to introduce him and bring him on board. And he's going to tell you about some large-scale projects that he's part of. And then we're going to engage in a little exercise around these 4 dimensions of impact, where you can participate a little, maybe meet each other, and then we'll come back together and give you some actionable direction going forward. So with that said, Susan?
Thank you. We're trying to figure out, I think Stefan might be logged in as somebody else. So I'm hoping that it is my great pleasure to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Stefan Savage. Dr. Savage is the Irwin and Joan Jacobs Chair in Information and Computer Science in the Department of Computer Science and Engineering at the University of California at San Diego. He is an ACM Fellow and recipient of many awards, including being named as MacArthur Foundation Fellow, the Genius Grant, in 2017. He is widely cited for his research in cybersecurity and has received multiple large NSF awards. We may have time for a few questions at the end, so if you have questions for Dr. Savage, please put them in the Q&A. Dr. Savage.
Thank you very much. So just to give some background. So I operate in computer science and engineering. And I guess one of the reasons I was invited is that I have done at least 2 of these large awards. And I've listed them here, one in 2004 and another in 2012. And for those of you who are interested, as a practice, I always make my proposals available. I've always been a little bit puzzled as why funded proposals should be secret. I think this, this is part of what got funded. So please feel free to look through these to your heart's content, and I'm happy to answer questions. So what I'm going to try to do for a few minutes is tell the story of how these happened and what it is that I learned around along the way about what running a large project is all about. Next slide, please. So I work primarily in computer security, and circa 2001, there had been some major worm outbreaks. For those of you who are old enough to remember this, there was Code Red and Slammer and these various things where they were taking over hundreds of thousands of computers in the course of days or even less than a day. And we had happened as a part of another project to build kind of the first infrastructure that was capable of tracking these events, and they were growing in severity. Next slide. So this led us to a research collaboration with the International Computer Science Institute, notably with Vern Paxson and his colleague Nick Weaver, and my colleague Jeff Volker. And we had started, independent of any funding, spending a bunch of time together working on this emerging problem because it interested us. And as the problem became more important, we saw that there was an opportunity for us. We happened to be in the right place at the right time when a big problem was happening. And so we went to DARPA because we said, hey, DARPA says they're dealing with big problems. Why don't we go to them and they can fund this? And we did a great job because DARPA concluded that it was a huge problem and they were going to fund a major effort on it. And then, and we competed for it. And then they said, you know what? It's too important. We are making it top secret. And so you can't participate. And so next, we re-upped to NSF, who had just started with these center scale proposals under what was the predecessor of the SATSI program, and benefited from that experience. And that then funded us doing a bunch of work on what we called internet epidemiology. Next slide. So this in turn, as happens in science, there's frequently serendipity. I always say our proposal is the promise of where we're going to go, not exactly what we're going to do. And this led us to looking at email spam, which I thought was a very banal topic. And it turned out that there was quite a bit that wasn't understood. And we then started looking at underground markets and botnets and economics. And the end result of this, depicted here, was this very complicated, like getting into the underlying economic and business dealings of cyber criminals around the world, which provided a focus for us in terms of, hey, we can actually look at all of this cybersecurity stuff through an economic lens, and that gives lots of new opportunities to do things. And so that provided the focus for our frontier proposal, which was the second one of our large proposals. Largely the same team, but with some expansion, adding social scientists and legal scholars and so forth. Next. So what did we do other than research? Because that's one of the elements that's being brought in here. The large is more than that, and it is a lot more. So while we did a ton of research, and there are many dozens of papers published during this time, we also did a bunch of things outside paper publishing. One is we gave a lot of talks, and these were not all to other academics. So half of them were organic because just we had a number of people in the team and they would go out and be invited to give talks and so forth. But about half were focused on stakeholders who cared about the results that we were working on. And so when we were working on cybercrime, it would be like, we're going to end up giving a talk to the Department of Justice. When we were working on, or some of this other stuff is FDA, or to other industry groups and so forth. We also created a bunch of new workshops so that we could focus the attention of the field, not just our work, but on the problems that we were promoting. so that there would be a venue that everyone would send their work to deal with these particular class of problems. We did a ton of tech transfer. So all of the logos listed there are companies. The one little one, NetSif, that was the startup that we did. And then the rest were interactions we had where we transferred technology directly into one or more of these companies. And all of you, I guarantee, use something we did. In part because if you use email, you have no choice. But this was a lot of work, and there were a lot of lessons learned that I'll be happy to talk with people about either in questions or in other times about how one does tech transfer with bigger companies. And you don't just show up and say, here's our stuff, why don't you take it? It's really a process. Next. And then the last is we spent a lot of time supporting government agencies, and some of this is a byproduct of what it was that we did. Because it started because a lot of agencies came calling and said, hey, we understand you're working on this and we saw that you did this thing. Can you tell us about X? In some cases, like there were criminal investigations and they wanted our data. In other cases, they wanted advice for how to do things. But about half of them we engaged because we realized there was an opportunity to actually get them to see the world the way we thought they should. Next. All right, so let's talk about the I word, impact. Which is about making things happen above and beyond just creating knowledge, all right? And this, and from my standpoint, is the confluence. If you think of the green ball in this, tropist picture as your research, normally it's just sitting there by itself, a nice green ball, hoping someone will do something with it. The other half is delivering / selling those ideas to the people who need to know, for whom it will change the way they practice, and they in turn can deliver that to others. Next. So here is my own graph that I made yesterday in thinking about where does the impact come from. And I will now call this the 3 Ps. And so there are 3 things that I think makes up impact. Number 1 is picking the right problem. So there's tons of problems, and some of them have greater potential at a particular point in time, right? Because impact, like if you wait long enough, lots of things can have impact. It's just harder to predict. But in the modest time frame where you have an opportunity to impact it, certain problems are in a position to have that effect versus others. So that's one. The other is partnerships, because you cannot possibly do this all yourself. And it's both partnerships with your co-PIs and your collaborators, but also partnerships with external organizations, be they companies or NGOs or government agencies or what have you, because the impact is ultimately coming from your interaction with them, not just you writing a paper. And then Prometheus is the act of bringing it, because the notion that like you have this great work and you just throw it over the fence and things happen is a total myth. It does not work that way. And there's a huge amount of work, every bit as much as the problem part, in trying to get this information understood the way it needs to be understood in the hands of those people. And then there's this little one called luck, which luck is just huge and you can't pretend it's not. Next. All right, so I'm gonna talk about each of these really briefly. So what you work on matters. The problem has to be big and important and ambitious enough and timely enough, kind of, there's a little bit of right time, right place thing, but it also has to be achievable. There's this Goldilocks aspect to it. You can't be like, I'm going to invent the teleporter and that will change everything, because everyone knows you're not going to invent the teleporter. Next. However, it's not only a property of the problem, right? So the problem contains the seeds of this ambition, but everyone has to see it the same way that you do. And so in fact, your job in trying to put one of these things together is to envision what are the consequences of your success and evangelize that view to everybody, both in your proposal, both before the proposal. So for a lot of this stuff, like the worm stuff, we were going around telling everyone, look, this is going to be a big, big problem. You need to understand why. And that's a part of it, because the framing is every bit as important as everything else, because that's how people understand what it is that you're doing. And you can't assume that they'll get it on their own. That's part of your job. Next. Partnerships. Okay. So there's 2 aspects to this that I think play a big role. One is your co-PIs, and there's 2 models that I've seen. The first next is organic collaborators. This is kind of the friends model. So you have people who are naturally working together, and they are working on something and they say, hey, let's go pursue a grant, kind of the example that I described earlier. The other model next is the Impossible Mission Force model, where you bring out your dossier and you start recruiting people that you need in order to put this grant together. And I've seen both of them work. They have different challenges. Next. So in particular, when you're running a large project, you have two twin challenges all the time. One is focus, because there's a gazillion things going on. And how do you keep people focused, eyes on the prize? What's the big picture? There inevitably are, through serendipity, all kinds of interesting things happen. How do you decide when everyone should move? How do you decide when people should stop what they're doing and go back to what they're doing before? And then how do you get people to agree on that? And I will say that it is, in my experience, a little bit easier to do that in the first model because everyone has started on the same page. When you start with the second model, you actually need much stronger management to keep people in line, because otherwise it can turn into a situation where everyone gets theirs and does their own thing. And I still remember when we got our first large, our program manager, whose name I'll leave out just in case, said, look, if we give you $600,000 and you screw up, you look bad. If we give you $6 million and you screw up, we look bad. So please don't screw up. And so a lot of this had to do with this issue. Like once you are, when they make a big bet, they want to get those synergies and not just have it be the equivalent of a gazillion little smalls. Next. The other issue is external partnerships. And this you have to actually do explicitly. So with respect to your research, who has what you need, whether it's data or equipment or opportunity or people or what have you, who cares about what you'll produce? Who are you trying to influence? How do you get to them? Who do you know who knows those people? And so there's a lot of meeting. And then what do they want? And this part is actually really key. In the beginning, I think we would think that stakeholders, we would just give them our great results and they would think that was spectacular. And that wasn't how it worked at all, in part because it turns out frequently our great results really weren't what they thought the problem was. So it turned out to be pretty important early on to engage with them, find out what they thought the problem was, and then find a way to solve at least some of their problem so that they were amenable to then having a deeper relationship. All right, next. All right, and then the last is this Prometheus aspect. So again, the myth is that great work speaks for itself. The reality is that it's not true at all. There's tons of great work that doesn't get picked up and carried, like Prometheus's fire to the humans, and it needs someone to do it. It needs some figure to make that translation from this scientific paper into the hands of people who need it, who may not speak exactly the same language and may see the world differently. And it is non-trivial work, but it gets easier over time. But there is a certain amount of anthropology to it, because unless the ultimate users that you have are like academic computer scientists, which is the rare case, they have a different worldview. Next. But there is this interesting bonus, which is that their view of the problems are usually quite different and very informative. So I have actually found that a lot of my really interesting research ideas have come about from talking to non-researchers and finding out about their stuff. All right. Aside, there's also a ton of valuable activity that isn't writing papers. And so I'm not going to go through all this, but when Kamala Harris was the AG of California, she came to us and said, hey, we're trying to write this thing about transnational crime. Can you talk to us about the cyber? And we spent a bunch of time providing them data for that. We spent a bunch of time with with reporters. So with the New York Times in particular, and that paid off tremendous dividends, because that relationship ultimately led to the New York Times writing an op-ed about our work saying, hey, the US government should consider doing this thing that was in this paper. And I cannot tell you how much impact an op-ed from the editors of the New York Times has in actually making people in government take notice, certainly much more than publishing a lot of papers at SIGCOMM. That they don't pick up on that. So we made an effort to spend a bunch of our time going to all these different things that are outside of kind of the normal cone, up to and including providing documents for people's court cases and all kinds of other things, because it let us kind of engage those broader set of people, some of whom might want to take this and run with it. Next. So finally, and then I'll take questions. Impact is not a kind of a bolt-on property. You don't have a proposal and say, let's impactify it. That's not really a thing. Once you start thinking in terms of what kinds of things have impact, it will influence what you choose to work on, how you work on it, who you tell about it and why, and so forth. So this is the kind of thing that really works best when it's something you are passionate about, because you have to sell why it is so important. That's a big part of the job. And with that, I'm done, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Great, that was wonderful. We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A and the chat. One is, did you foresee the percentage of outreach activities versus research that you'd be engaged in when you did the Frontier proposal? When did this dawn on you?
So the first time we had no clue at all, right? So we fell into it. And in part, it's because it was really interesting. When we did the second proposal, the Frontier, we knew what we were getting into because we had our feet wet. And in fact, I think that's part of what helped us get the Frontier, because how do they know when you write the proposal that you can do all of these things? It's a tough thing. They have to bet on you as a team, because the proposal says we're going to do all kinds of crazy stuff, and you don't get any more pages. And so it ends up being vague and so forth. You'll see in our proposal. And so part of what they're betting on is that you have shown that you will do this work and it is something of value to you. And that's part of the bet. So the second time we knew. The first time was just, we fell into the deep end of the pool and didn't drown.
Excellent. So one thing I'm curious about is, so if you could just boil it down, what's the most important thing that you know now that you wish you had known when you started planning your first large or expedition proposal?
Oh, that's a great question. I think I'm gonna do two things because I can't figure out which one is the most important. So one is spending a fair amount of time thinking about who cares and spending time. I actually now spend a bunch of time contacting those people first to make sure that I really understand their problem, and that in the proposal I can speak to it. That it's not just, I think this is, but like, here is what I have learned from doing the research in this other field, from talking with these people and so forth, so that the reviewers know that this isn't just me inventing it, but that there's more to it than that. The other, I think that we absolutely didn't know when we first showed up. We started going to companies, because a lot of what I do is data centric and we need various kinds of data. And so we would just show up to companies and say, hey, will you give us our data? It's for science. And that led to nothing, like we crickets. And so I think what I have come to learn is that that it is worthwhile in your relationships with other organizations to spend time understanding what would actually make their lives better, and spend time doing that thing, even if it is not precisely the huge scientific accomplishment that you want, but because it builds the relationship that lets you do more things. And so that's how we engage with companies now. The first thing we say is, tell us about your problems and let's see what we can do to address that. Same with government agencies. And then we say, now that we have succeeded, you know what would be interesting? That's been a lot more successful.
Excellent. Can you, I think we have time for one more quick one. Do you have any not to do's when you're trying to convince others that your vision, which is often not common, will address an important problem?
I would say, it's hard because I don't know. This is such a big area. I would, stay away from too many tropes. I think it is hard to convince people of a vision that has already been sold several times. And so, and that's just a reality, that it's hard to resell the same ideas in a different context. And not to say that there's not great work to be done there. It's a reality of how people will internalize your words.
Excellent. So I'm afraid we're out of time, but we really appreciate you joining us. And I will say you've got a very interesting website There are a lot of additional questions, some of which I think people can cyber stalk you on your website and find answers to. But thank you so much. I really appreciate this. And next we move on to Nick, who's going to set us up for our impacts exercise.
So thank you. And yeah, that was a wonderful presentation. I learned so much. Thank you, Stefan. But so the we need to think about impact, right? And if you look at the survey before we came to the session, generating impact was super important, right? The bigger numbers are more, and smaller numbers are less, right? So is it very important? Absolutely. Is it difficult? Well, you have the challenge there, but so the point of this slide is that not challenging is the extreme for challenge. There we go. I see the bottom of it. I had a little thing pop up. We just redid these slides. I apologize. But very important is economic impact, workforce impact, innovation impact. We all see that it's very important. And of course, they're all also very challenging. And that's where we are. And one of the things Stefan mentioned was, that he mentioned the word sales. He said that, we have to understand our consequences and we want to evangelize those consequences. Another way of thinking about that is to say, well, we need to not only drive those outcomes, make sure that we're doing the right things, but we need to understand what they are and we need to communicate what they are. So that's going to be our little exercise here. If we could go to the next slide, Joel. Remember our 4 dimensions of impact. If you haven't committed these to memory, maybe write them down. They'll be part of our exercise. But think about situations where, sure, you're driving impact and intentionally leading situations that bring about the impact, but also, what you've done to understand and communicate the impact that you've had. What we found when we do executive sessions, I'm at a business school, if we haven't mentioned that before, although I study science enterprises as well. But one of the things we see when we teach executives in the business school is that a lot of the time they get the most benefit out of, not the most, but equal benefit out of meeting each other, talking to each other. And these are accomplished people. The people on this call, the 700 of you, are accomplished researchers and accomplished leaders, and you've done wonderful things. So we'd like to take a little bit of time for you to learn from each other, and then we're going to try and catalog some of these learnings afterwards. So we're going to do a little exercise. You're going to go into breakout groups now, and this is what's going to happen. Now, we only have 20 minutes, so you're going to have to be very task focused. The very first thing that you want to do, and I suggest that you take some notes right now because I'm not sure how we're going to communicate these instructions to your breakout groups. But the first thing that you need to do is one person is going to volunteer in your breakout group, and that person is going to make sure you stay to your timing, and that person will take notes. Then there will be quick introductions, 30 seconds each maximum. Don't go on and on about what you do. Make it concise, and everybody in your group will do introductions. Then individually, and again, you're only going to have 5 to 7 minutes for this, so don't spend a lot of time. Just pick something, a successful practice that you've engaged in that has driven impact, understood the impact, communicated the impact, right? In order to communicate anything, you need to understand it. Just think of something you did that went well, something that was successful, right? And share it with the group, how you did that, what the practice, right? We call this best practice in business schools. We use the term best practice. Really, it just means successful practice, something that worked for somebody. All right. And then discuss some of the things people put out there and discuss how they fit in these dimensions, right? That we talked about. And then as a group, and your volunteer leader is going to keep you on track as far as timing, as a group, identify 2 or 3 practices. And then sometime after the session, we're going to ask you for what those practices were that your group identified. And then we're going to share it with the broader group. Okay. So that's your, and I'd like you to, if you could, just take a moment to write this down, right? Volunteer, a couple minutes intro, 5 to 7 minutes. Each of you identify a practice, 5 to 7 minutes, discuss them and how they fit in the 4 dimensions, and then pick your top 2 or 3 that you're going to share with the broader group, and we're going to record for everybody. All right, you're going to have to do all that in 20 minutes, so we have to be very quick. And if Joel, you could go to the next slide. The trick is you're going to go back to the platform. Now, so here's the deal. Zoom does not allow us to put, I guess we have 600 to 700 people on in Zoom sessions all at the same time. So we need to
actually the limit that we learned is that all Zoom accounts only have up to 50 breakouts.
Yeah, so we have only 50 breakouts. Now this is what you'll have to do. You'll have to go back to the main program, and what you'll do is see that there are breakout rooms, and you'll have to go to the breakout room, and we decided based on the month of your birth. So, if you're January, you'll go to one breakout room. If you're born in July, you'll go to another breakout room. That's how we're doing it. Afterwards, when you're going to come back to this session, so you'll get out of your Zoom groups. So right now you're going to go do that. You'll get into your breakout groups. When you're done, you will come back to here. Now, I realize you'll be tempted to say, okay, I did that. Now I'm gone. I'm going to get on with my day. But you're missing some of the tremendous tools we're going to provide you and really set up the next 3 sessions as the kind of debrief from this. And we're also going to do a little poll question when we come back. So you're going to have to come back here in about 20 minutes. Joel, did I miss anything?
Nope. The one thing is that when you return to the main thing, you can click on the back to the event hub, or you can just go to the launch button that you use to get into this session. But the point is that we have 5 separate Zoom accounts for each of the 5 breakouts. So you're in a different Zoom account for the breakout, but then you'll be back to this account for the final thoughts to launch us into the next session. So with that, I'll stop the share and encourage you to go to the breakout that corresponds with the month of your birthday. So Nick, do you want to walk us through the polls, and Menon will then send them out?
Yeah, so Menon will let you know how this is happening, and we'll show the results real time, correct, Joel?
Yeah.
So you're going to get the links to these poll questions. The first is reflect on yourself and your group, and what dimension of impact did most of the successful practices that your group fit into, right? So you see it should have popped up there. So when your group was talking about it, which dimension of impact do you think got the most attention as far as practices people had? Which one, conversely, did you have the most difficulty identifying successful practices? Were there anywhere there were just no successful practices, that sort of thing? And then reflect on yourself personally and think, okay, which dimension do I want the most help with? Do I want to have the most direction? So if you could do those quickly, we'll look at the results. So you see your poll questions, they should have popped up.
And as is typical with these polls, we'll give it 1 minute and then we'll look at the results. Menon, are you ready to show us?
Yep, so if you just click the polling option in the bottom of your screen, the information will pop up. Do you see it updating?
I don't, but I will stop the share and then I probably will.
Yeah.
Oh, there we go.
So I get the polling option, but I can't click on any of the.
That's because you're a panelist. The participants can.
Oh, but I'm not a panelist.
Well, you should be.
Can everyone get, Menon, I'm not seeing any options besides just the poll coming up.
Do you see I see the polling, I see the results coming up.
Can you share
So when
them
you
on
click
your
the
screen,
polling button on
Menon?
the bottom,
Can you share your screen and share them with us then?
I can't share Zoom, but why don't I do this?
Because
Yeah, sorry about that.
perfect, that worked.
Great.
Okay, so we have the initial results. On the first question, most of you talked about impact through science and engineering, but about 10% talked about economic impact, close to 20% workforce impact, and about 16% for innovation impact. Now other people are saying that they can't see the results.
Right. You're not sharing your screen. There's no.
Yeah, so I believe that the poll results will only be, they'll only be able to see them after, because when you share the screen on Zoom, it won't show anything from Zoom. What you could do though is,
can people see my screen now?
no, they
see your
can't see the
screen.
Zoom polling option.
Why don't you just go ahead and tell us what's happening, and then
In any event, I will tell you what the results are, and I apologize for the screen share. So once again, the first question is, which dimension of impact did most of the successful practices fit in? 56%, 202 of you said science and engineering, and economic was 10%, workforce 19%, and innovation 16%. In terms of the impact that you had the most difficulty identifying successful practices, economic jumped off the page. About 60% of you said that was the hardest to figure out. And certainly when we do our stakeholder session, we'll talk about how to align stakeholders in industries. But 6% for science, 18% workforce, and 20% innovation. And lastly, which impact would you like the most help with? Economic was at 48%, workforce 21%, innovation 26%, and only 5% science. So that gives you a sense as to what the results were. We're almost at time, but I'm going to share my screen so Nick can walk us through the final thoughts.
And this is the issue that we run into, that, you know, for the most part, yeah, let's just keep going. Next slide, Joe.
Yeah.
For the most part, the reason we've found, and if you listen to Stefan's presentation, the reason we found that these thinking about, you know, understanding the impacts, driving these impacts, the reason it's sometimes difficult is because different stakeholders, and we use the term stakeholder, in the next session, we'll really dig into what that means, find different elements to be more important. So one stakeholder might find a few aspects, another. Now, if you go to the next slide, there are different mindsets they have when looking at it. Some want to see compliance. They want to see adherence and accountability with what their expectations are. Others want to see efficient and effective operations, and others want to see, you know, change, innovation, and novelty. So when you get to, and here's the final slide, the next slide, what you'll find is that for each stakeholder, you need to think through what it is they want from you. Do they want compliance? What, as Stefan mentioned, you know, there's this issue of you go work with industry. Well, what's in it for them? Well, something is in it for them in one of these dimensions and in one of these categories of each dimension. This is the sort of thing we're going to be unpacking in the next few sessions. So if I could get to the next slide. Remember, the idea here is that we're going broad. It's an evolution. We seem to be good understanding the impact of our science. We need to understand and communicate our impact more broadly. John?
I would just point out one thing on that. If you go back to the word cloud, at the beginning, it says people have limited time. If you look at this large leader thing up in the upper right-hand corner, the large leader doesn't have to do all of this, but the large leader has to see to it that it's done.
Super.
It's not a work speed up.
Thank you, John. Thank you, Nick. And thank you, Susan. And thank you to our keynote speakers, Stefan and Margaret. Just to wrap up, the next session, we're going to unpack this idea of stakeholders, and particularly how do you do a well-posed value proposition to understand the impacts that a stakeholder is looking for. Then we're going to talk about how to measure impact in ways that will make a difference. And then we're going to talk about leadership, and not just project management, but project leadership for 4 years or longer. There are more sessions to follow, but this is just a heads up of the next 3. We're delighted to have you all here, and we really appreciate the community of practice that you represent as researchers looking to make the leap to large. Thank you very much.